Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today we're going to do a little bit of a show and tell, and first up we have Schlumbergera russeliana. This is a cultivated specimen of the species, and it was seed grown from a cross of two Schlumbergera russeliana, which obviously still produces Schlumbergera russeliana. It's not a hybrid or anything, it's just a cultivar. And this was registered not so long ago as EMS, and it was given to me as a small graft, a seedling graft, and I've been growing it for a little while now, and it's bloomed twice. It bloomed last year when I moved the plants outside, and now it's blooming this year again. It's got beautiful, delicate little flowers, and you can see the flowers are symmetrical. They're very tiny. The flowers are just a different kind of color. It's like a vibrant sort of fuchsia color with like a little tiny bit of like a purplish kind of tinge to them. But you can see it's totally concolorous. The whole entire thing is just fuchsia. And that actually includes the stamen and the stigma. And I don't know if we can see. Let's see if we can zoom in here a little bit. There we go. You can see the stamen and the stigma are also that concolorous sort of fuchsia color. It's kind of crazy. And then the pollen you can see is also kind of a little bit differently colored, maybe a little bit grayish looking. This was grafted onto a Schlumbergera truncata hybrid, and you can see how well the graft points eventually like callus over and become very woody at the base. So it looks nice and old now. So it's very, very established at this point. I've sent cuttings of this to a handful of people, and at least one of them, I believe I sent cuttings of this last year. And so I think when they originally got it, they thought like after a while that it wasn't going to make it, but it pulled through and did. What I do find is that this is a very robust clone of this species. So it seems like it's a little bit easier to grow just in general. And you can see how absolutely beautiful it is. But yeah, several people have asked me for cuttings of this, of course, because being a new cultivar of Schlumbergera russeliana, everyone is kind of excited and wants it. So it's going to get out there into cultivation eventually. But yeah, just absolutely lovely, an absolute beast. And you know, if you watch this channel, you may have remembered that there were actually two little seedling grafts, and they were siblings. The other one, the graft just sort of randomly failed, and then it was falling all over the place, and I didn't really notice what was going on. And I believe I like took all of the pieces that fell and I like chucked them into a container, and then I believe that I forgot about them, which is one of the biggest woes of having a large collection. You of course just kind of forget about things. Next up we have Hatiora Herminiae, and this is another one that is just really hard to grow. You know, somebody actually asked recently in one of the Facebook groups, like, is that species really that hard to grow? Yes, it is. In a normal home environment, under completely normal circumstances, this is one of the worst species you can even try to grow. So it really, really wants super stable conditions. It wants super stable substrate, like in terms of moisture. It wants it to always be the same amount of moisture. It doesn't want to be overwatered, underwatered. It doesn't want the air to be too dry or too humid or anything like that. It's also so highly susceptible to getting mites. So that's another really big problem. If it gets mites, it will just drop all of its stems. You'll be left with a stick, and you pretty much have to start growing it all over again. So yeah, growing it on its own roots in a normal home environment is just really going to be a no-go. If you live in the right place or have the right conditions, so if you live in probably someplace like California, you might be able to grow it outside in normal conditions in its own substrate. I kind of don't think so even there though. Not unless you're like a super lucky grower, you know what I mean? Like there's always that one person that's like, well, I can grow it. You know what I mean? Like, so maybe there's one of those people in California somewhere. But for the most part, where I've seen most people have success with this species is growing in a greenhouse environment where conditions are just super stable. Otherwise, if you're going to try to grow it in a home environment, get it grafted. So here it's grafted on Pereskiopsis. You can see the graft. This is a very old graft at this point. This has been grafted on here for oh my goodness, years at this point. So it's been grafted for a really, really long time. I have had many bouts of mite issues with this plant, but I think in the last 2 years, when I just actively started treating for mites, it resolved all of my problems with that. And so this is the first time that these guys have taken to just really putting on a flower show. So I've got multiples of these, and they just were like, we're just going to flower like crazy. One of the things that always surprises me about this particular species is how large the flowers are. Like, they're quite a bit bigger in comparison to most of the flowers of Hatiora salicornioides. These are maybe like triple the size. So they're just kind of large. And of course, that beautiful color that they have is just crazy. This one too, it could prove to be a little bit harder to flower. And if you've had it for a long time and it's never flowered, I highly suggest dropping the temperatures a little bit, because this is another one that grows at a little bit higher elevation. So a little bit of cool temperatures can induce flowering with it. It's absolutely magnificent when you see it flower, though. Even if it just produces one flower, it's magnificent. It's just a magnificent species. So everyone wants it. But of course, the crazy, crazy beautiful ones are always just like the most difficult, right? So this is Deamia testudo. Now, the last time I looked at this plant, it was classified as Strophocactus testudo. But according to Wikipedia here, there's a little section in taxonomy where it says in 2003, Ralph Bauer transferred it to the genus Strophocactus. But in 2002, Alexander Dowald had revived Deamia for both this species and another formerly placed in Solenus cereus. Molecular phylogenetic studies in 2017 and 2018 confirmed the monophyly of the genus Deamia, of which Deamia testudo is the type species. But it does kind of grow similarly to a Strophocactus. So it like winds its way around tree trunks, tree branches, clambers all over. Totally wild looking species. This is not that impressive because these are just like baby cuttings that I got. I think I got them 2 years ago. And so I'm excited, and I've always been excited to see this plant grow. Now, there's another one that I see out there that is like commonly you'll find it like for sale commercially as a Dogtail cactus. And I don't know if they're the same species and if that is like a juvenile form or what the deal is, because this is not soft and pliable like that one is. This is like tough, hard. It's like it's not pliable at all, basically, is what I'm trying to say. It also has very aggressive hard spines. They are extremely aggressive. It also has little pups here, like new little stems that it's growing. I call them pups just because this one looks so much like a terrestrial desert cacti. So in all reality, it doesn't. It really, really doesn't look like a terrestrial desert cacti at all. Like not when you see the full mature ones. But I think about 2 years, I got a cutting of this. Maybe it was 2 cuttings. I'm not entirely sure. And I chucked them in this pot, and it's just in my standard epiphytic cacti mix. And it's just been slowly growing. And I just think it's magnificent. This is Schlumbergera opuntioides, and this is growing on its own roots, which is kind of a miracle. But once I've figured out how to deal with the whole weird flat mite thing, I've been able to get some of these Schlumbergera species that are typically very hard to grow just fine on their own roots. As long as I'm on top of the mite thing, as long as I'm preemptive about it and I treat it and I take care of them, it works out. This, however, grows in my basement as well, where it's a little bit cooler and it does get sprayed regularly with water, so it does keep mite populations down and gives it a much better chance of growing. So it's not like it's growing upstairs in a window or something. It's growing in a well-lit basement with grow lights and everything. Here is one of my grafted ones. So this is grafted on Pereskiopsis, and I've always found this so strange, but the grafted ones are much more spiny than ones that are growing on their own roots from the same specimen. Like these are the exact same plant. a stem fell off this plant and I threw it in that pot and it rooted. Now that's a plant. So you can see it just has way less stems. And so see how that one just fell off? That's what I mean. Like if you bump it, it was set on the table, and sometimes the stems, they just are very easy to knock off. But they make new plants pretty easily. And you can see this one is actually pretty wizened and old, lots and lots of corking kind of thing here. It's got a lot of corking at the bottom, but also a lot of that is actually like old mite damage. So it took a while for me to be able to get even the grafted one to grow super well. Like they just had to be treated for mites was all. But there you can see the little stem that I knocked off, which I'll just end up throwing back in the pot, and then hopefully it will make a new little plant. Just like this one, this has actually rooted in there and is something I should probably pull out and stick in a different pot and let it turn into its own plant. You can also see that these guys have buds, but the odds are these buds will abort. They will not actually make it all the way to flowering. And part of the reason why that is because it is not cold enough. This is a higher elevation species. And so my basement probably hits lows of maybe 50 to 55 degrees. And that is just not cold enough. So every year they'll produce an abundance of flower buds down there, but they don't make it all the way to flowering. It's not until I move them outside in the spring where the temperatures might fall below that. So they might actually get down to about 45. At that point, they will actually carry flowers all the way to term. So keep that in mind about this one. I don't think that it's that hard to grow. It maybe just needs a little bit less water and a little bit cooler temperatures, and probably will need to be treated for mites quite often. But it is a little bit tough to flower if you aren't like growing it outside in cooler temperatures come springtime. Also, as I was sitting here with this plant, I noticed that it had mealybugs that were hiding. And you can see how the mealybugs are hiding in the crevices between the stems on the underside of the plant. So this was tucked away in the basement in a place where I could not actually physically get to, but bringing it out, I can clearly see that it has some mealybugs. So if you want to stay tuned at the very end of the video, you'll see me treat this plant for those mealybugs. And then next up, we have our relative, Schlumbergera microsphaerica. This is another one that has been quite miraculous in terms of being able to get it to grow on its own roots. And as a matter of fact, I struggle more with growing this grafted now than with growing it on its own roots. So this has been growing like this for a couple of years, and it was the same kind of thing. I had some grafts and some stems knocked off, and I just tossed them in a pot, laid them down, they rooted, and they turned into plants. These guys grow super well for me outside during the growing season. It was just that when I would bring them in, they would start to struggle if I tried to grow them upstairs in the house where it was too warm. Downstairs in the basement, they do much better as long as, again, I spray them and I keep on top of them and everything. And you can see the same thing here. The base of the plant is nice and woody and everything. And also odd, but this particular one, like, I think that it must just be kind of a juvenile thing, but you can see how the stems are quite a bit more spiny. And so this one either just produces spinier stems when grown on its own roots, or that's a juvenile growth. But it's interesting because I have seen wild specimen of this particular species that have a lot more spines than ones that we typically see in cultivation. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm like really wondering if growing it on its own roots was the thing that made it do that, or maybe it was like giving it more sunlight or something. In any case, I have never brought this species all the way to flower. You can kind of see on it that there are buds, but I think that these buds that we can see here are actually already aborted. They aren't even new flower buds. And what's going on with this one is very similar to Schlumbergera opuntioides. It's not cold enough. And if Schlumbergera opuntioides is a cool grower, this one is an even more of a cool grower. So this one grows at even higher elevations and needs even cooler temperatures than that. You can see that this little stem fell off and it was already producing a little root just in the air. So we'll just toss that on the surface of the pot and it will root and grow. That's just what I do with them. But that's kind of a challenge because this year, I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to move these guys out when the temperatures are maybe at like 40 or even a little bit lower than 40 in the hopes to finally get Schlumbergera microsphaerica to actually flower. So fingers crossed that that works out. I talked a little bit about this when I was doing the epidermal sort of scans for Rhipsalis a little while ago, but I figured that I would actually show this plant because I got so excited, guys, when I saw that this plant was actually starting to grow. Oh my gosh. This is Rhipsalis pulchra, but the way that the story goes, I imported this like a couple of years ago. I'm going to guess it was probably like 2 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. And I remember that it looked a little bit odd when it got to me. I don't totally remember what it looked like, but I remember that it looked a little bit odd and it was not something that had a species delineation. So it was just Rhipsalis species with a collection number, with a field number. And, you know, I figured that when it flowered, we'd figure it out or whatever. But I also figured that it was probably like Rhipsalis bassifera or maybe even a Rhipsalis teres or something, because a lot of times those don't get identified so easily. It was outside and I had it like in a little pot and I believe I was trying to root it and it was not having a very good time of things. So I think whatever branches that original cutting had, they just fell off and died. And so I was just kind of left with a stick in the pot. Now, I didn't throw the plant out. I remember just keeping it and kind of like tucking it away in weird places. Like it definitely wasn't in the front and center of my collection or whatever. But then, you know, obviously when I did the epidermal scans, I was like, oh, this is something totally different than what I thought it was. So I had contacted the person that I got it from and I was like, hey, have you seen this bloom yet? And they were like, yeah, here's the flower. And I was like, oh no, this plant was Rhipsalis pulchra, like a gorgeous clone of Rhipsalis pulchra. And so I'm like, oh man, thank goodness I didn't throw it away. Because when I say it was a stick, it was a stick. Here it was just like this little stick with like a couple of little branches and it still really hadn't grown very well or anything like that. And you know what I think? I think that Rhipsalis pulchra must be a little bit harder to grow. I'm going to guess that it might grow at a little bit higher elevation. So it must be a little bit of a cooler grower, which is why I was probably having some difficulties with it for a while. So for some mysterious reason, though, wherever it was, it decided to grow like a couple of little branches and I just literally paid it no mind. But when I looked at it the other day, I could clearly see that it was starting to put on lots of new little branches. Guys, I'm so afraid to even touch this plant because I'm afraid to like knock off any of the new growth or anything. So I'm being like super cautious here and not really wanting to move it around and touch it and stuff. But you can see all the new little growth that's coming out everywhere. So I'm super excited about that because I just cannot wait to see this plant flower. Like, just, I can't wait. And something that I've noticed now about Rhipsalis pulchra that I think is kind of interesting is now having looked at 3 different clones of this plant. 2 of the clones are kind of similar. This particular one and another clone, they have like a similar kind of pliable growth. They are a little tiny bit reminiscent of something like Rhipsalis puniciodiscus, but like not really. Just it's only kind of. But the other clone that I have looks a little bit more like Rhipsalis flacosa. Kind of. So it's kind of a weird thing because now that I've also seen more wild pictures of these, it seems like it can vary pretty strongly in what it kind of looks like. Sometimes it looks very much like a Rhipsalis flacosa, and sometimes it looks very much like Rhipsalis puniciodiscus, or some intermediate between those two types of things. So definitely kind of a weird one for sure. I love these nubbins. Look at those nubbins. I'm just so excited that this plant is finally actually doing something and growing. So fingers crossed this growth stays, that it grows well, that it's healthy, and that it just keeps growing, because I am just too excited about having this plant. So last, we have this Rhipsalis. So this is supposed to be Rhipsalis olivifera, and it's kind of weird to me because like this plant, like I had talked about when I did the epidermal scans, it looks a lot like Rhipsalis elliptica to me, which might kind of make sense, but I don't know because, you know, going through some things and some of the plants that I've seen now that are supposed to be Rhipsalis olivifera, I'm like, holy man, that is really confusing looking. So Rhipsalis olivifera needs like way more study and everything with the flowers and stuff to like, for me specifically, because having never personally seen the flower and never really seeing any really good pictures of the plant, this is a pretty confusing one for me. I absolutely love this plant. So a friend of mine gave me a cutting. He gave me a cutting last year, and the cutting rooted and everything, and then it started to grow a little bit outside, and then I moved it inside when the weather got too cold, and it went into one of the greenhouse cabinets. And it just started growing, and it just kept on growing and growing and growing. And I'm like, wow, that Rhipsalis is a really good growing Rhipsalis. And so even from this picture, I actually took 2 cuttings off of this plant and like sent them away to someone. So this plant was even a little bit bigger than this. And I've never seen a plant, a Rhipsalis, grow quite like that. Like they grow pretty well, but this continuously grew throughout the whole entire winter. But then even crazier is that not only did it grow like that, but now it's trying to flower. And this is not trying to flower off of like super old growth or anything. Like that grew literally like 2 months ago. So it's like trying to produce all these flowers off of growth that it literally has produced within the past year. Not even just within the past year, like since fall. I don't know, like I've seen a lot of Rhipsalis, and I've seen Rhipsalis like produce flowers off of last year's growth, but I don't think I've ever seen Rhipsalis so quickly produce flowers off of like 6 months ago type of growth, right? So it was super mind-boggling to me because I was like, how is that doing that? So the only other species that I've ever seen behave kind of like that is Rhipsalis elliptica. I don't think I've ever seen any other species produce flowers off of growth as quickly as that one. And that one's really floriferous too, you know? So like I said, in the epidermal thing or whatever, like just because I think this looks like Rhipsalis elliptica and shares some traits doesn't mean that it's not Rhipsalis olivifera. Like I've also read texts that say that Rhipsalis elliptica and Rhipsalis olivifera are pretty similar. I think that for me personally, I just need to see flowers and do a lot more study and everything about Rhipsalis olivifera in general before I can truly determine whether or not species are Rhipsalis olivifera. But absolutely cool species. I love this guy so much. And now it's time to deal with these mealybugs. I'm going to use isopropyl alcohol here. It's 91%. You can use a lower percentage. This is just what I have in the house. I'm going to put that in a dish, and then I'm going to use this soft bristled brush to basically like apply the alcohol to all of the nooks and crannies and crevices and everything. And you can see that I pretty much just did the whole entire plant. And if you're concerned about those flower buds, I'm going to say that those flower buds, they wouldn't have made it anyway. And even if I thought that they would have, I still would have treated the plant because you know what? getting rid of the pests is more important than seeing the flowers. So that's just what needed to happen here. But I am just going to stop talking, and you can watch me clean this plant if you want, if you were ever wondering how.